It's 4:15 a.m. on October 4th, 2009, in Mount Vernon, New Hampshire. Milford Sergeant Kevin Furlong receives a dispatch for a possible home invasion and robbery. Possible because someone had called 911 from a home telephone, but no one was on the other line. Mount Vernon is a small town. In 2009, it only had about 2,400 people. It sits about 60 miles from Boston. It's rural, with dirt roads and big, beautiful lots that leave a lot of room between you and your neighbors. It's great if you want privacy, but it also leaves you secluded. And the house that this officer is headed to is no exception. There are no streetlights, and the house sits on 5 acres off a dirt road in a heavily wooded area. As Furlong leaves his vehicle and walks closer to the house, he notices that some lights are on inside. He goes to one of the windows and tries to get a look of what's going on inside the house before attempting to enter. And that's when he sees it. Something that will haunt him forever. Inside the house, standing alone, is a little girl, covered head to toe in blood. Hi, strangers. I'm your host, Alexa Morrissey, and today's story is less of a whodunit and more a mystery of why. This is the brutal murder of Kimberly Cates. Lock your doors and listen closely. This is Stranger in the House. When Officer Furlong sees the bloody little girl through the window, he immediately radios for an EMT and then goes to break the front door open. The officer stays with the little girl until the EMT arrives, and he learns that she's 11-year-old Jamie Cates. It's clear that she has been stabbed several times, with the worst lacerations on her face and feet. A doctor would later testify that she would have died of a punctured lung if she had collapsed before help had arrived. Aside from the punctured lung and the many lacerations she had on her, Jamie's arm was broken, her jaw was shattered, and her skull was cracked. Before Jamie leaves with the EMTs to undergo emergency surgery, she tells an officer that she and her mother were sleeping in her parents' room when a man with a sword attacked them, and she eventually had to play dead until he left. Covered in blood, she was able to make her way to the kitchen phone and dial 911, but was in too much of a state of shock to speak. She told the officer who later found her, "They killed my mommy." With Jamie being attended to, the sergeant re-enters the home. In one of the bedrooms, he finds Jamie's mother, 42-year-old Kimberly Cates, lying on her bed, deceased and covered in blood. The medical examiner would later testify that Kimberly had been stabbed 32 times, some of those wounds puncturing organs and going right through the bone. Her cause of death, however, was massive blood loss, which means that unfortunately, Kimberly was alive for most of her assault. So who did this? And why? Were there multiple people since Jamie said they killed my mommy? And where was Kimberly's husband? There are so many questions, but let's start with the victim. Who was Kimberly Cates? Kimberly, also known as Kim, was born in Toledo, Ohio on March 6, 1967, but she grew up in Arizona. She attended nursing school at a community college in Tucson and eventually worked at the Tucson Medical Center. Her friend said that she really found her calling when she started working with children in the pediatric unit. She was introduced to her husband, an engineer named David Cates, in July of 1997. And after only 3 months of dating, Kim and David married and had their daughter Jamie a year later. Kimberly's friend said that she and Jamie were extremely close. They seemed to communicate without talking sometimes, like they just knew what the other person was thinking. Kimberly and her family moved to Mount Vernon to experience that quiet small-town life in 2009, less than a year before the murder. She was said to have been quickly taken in by the community, making lots of friends. People always seemed naturally drawn to Kimberly's energy. But, according to one Boston Globe article, Kimberly told a neighbor that she was a little nervous about how isolated the house was. It made her feel vulnerable. The house was in a wooded area with no streetlights. The road got very little traffic, but it was known to be a backroads shortcut for local teenagers on their way to a series of waterfalls that was a hangout spot for them. So aside from the occasional rowdy teen driving by, her block was normally dead silent. Her neighbor said that after sharing her concerns, she and Kimberly vowed to take care of each other. If they ever heard anything happen, they would come over. But unfortunately, the night of Kimberly's murder, the neighbor didn't hear anything. By now, I'm sure you're wondering, where is the husband, David Cates? Kimberly and David were still together, but he happened to be away on business in Maryland that night. Jamie had been sleeping in her parents' room because it was just them in the house. As the EMTs took Jamie to the hospital, the police were able to contact David Cates, and it was confirmed that he was in fact in Maryland for work and was quickly ruled out as a suspect. Once David gets that devastating call, he starts immediately packing to go be with his daughter. Back at the crime scene, in the early hours of October 4th, investigators start taking photographs of various areas of the home, including the basement, where it appears that a screen from a window has been removed. Police also take notice of the porch, and it seems that one of the windows had an air conditioner that was removed. Without the AC, it was deemed large enough that a person could fit through that window. The police also discovered that a part of the house's electricity, including the bedroom where the attack happened, had been turned off. But before police can really analyze much of this scene, they get a call that shocks them and puts this case into hyperdrive. That afternoon, only hours after the police start investigating, a woman calls the station with a disturbing story. Her 18-year-old son, Kyle Fenton, and his friend were hanging out at her home in Amherst, which is only 4 miles from Mount Vernon. Kyle's 2 other friends, 17-year-old Stephen Spader and 19-year-old Chris Gribble, unexpectedly pull into his driveway. Kyle goes out to say hi, and they're just chatting for a couple minutes when suddenly the conversation takes a turn. Stephen and Chris start bragging about breaking into a house and murdering 2 people in Mount Vernon. Now, Kyle doesn't believe them, obviously, and thinks they're just making some sort of sick joke. But to prove it, Stephen takes Kyle to the trunk of Chris's car and shows him weapons, including a machete wrapped in cloth. He starts to wonder if maybe they're telling the truth. He described the 2 of them as very happy to tell the story, almost excited. When Chris and Stephen leave after a little bit, Kyle goes in to check the news. And to his horror, he sees that the details of his friend's story matched Kimberly Cates' murder. Kyle goes to his mother with the information, and she calls in the tip to the police. After hearing this story, the police sent a state trooper to Chris Gribble's house in Brookline, which is about 20 minutes from the Cates' house in Mount Vernon. The trooper looks for Chris's vehicle that supposedly has the weapons in it, but the car is not there. So the trooper goes to the home of Stephen Spader. And wouldn't you know it, he spots the car. As the officer arrives, he notices that Spader, Gribble, and another young man are leaving the house. He stops them and asks Chris, can he search his car? And Chris agrees right away. And despite his ease and cooperation, the trooper finds a lot of incriminating things. Like a machete, rope, garbage bags, a shovel covered in dirt, a receipt for a knife bought at a military store, and a receipt from a pawn shop dated from the day of the murder. The trooper asks if he can take all 3 of them back to the station for questioning, which they all agree to. When they get back to the station, the police start with the 3rd young man. He is 19-year-old Autumn Savoy from Hollis, New Hampshire. Savoy was a high school dropout who worked as a dishwasher for a banquet hall in Hollis. It's unclear how Spader and Savoy met, but those who knew them knew that they were very close. And as it turns out, Savoy is Spader and Gribble's alibi for the evening. Autumn says that the night of October 3rd, hours before the murder, he was hanging out with his girlfriend, and she left around 11:30 p.m. Around 2 a.m., Chris and Stephen arrive in Chris's car, and they all hang out in Autumn's driveway and smoke some marijuana. He says after they hang out for a bit, Autumn goes to sleep in the house, and Stephen and Chris sleep in Stephen's car in the driveway, which I personally find is a weird alibi. The cops tell Autumn that they talked to other witnesses in the area, and they know that's not true. that Chris and Steven did not sleep in his driveway last night. And that's when Autumn instantly caves and tells the officer exactly what happened. The day before the murder, Chris Gribble drops Steven Spader off at Autumn's house, and Spader sleeps over. The next day, around 12:30 p.m., Chris comes back to pick Spader up from Autumn's house. Before Spader leaves, he casually tells Autumn that he and Chris are going to murder somebody. And obviously, Autumn does not believe him because of how he just casually said it. He says goodbye and doesn't think anything else of it. On October 4th at 5:24 a.m., a little more than an hour after Jamie Cates is found bloodied in her home, Spader calls Autumn. Spader tells Autumn that night, he, Chris Gribble, and two other friends named Billy Marks and Quinn Glover went to Mount Vernon with the intention of finding a home to invade and burglarize. Originally, they had targeted the house next to the Cates home, but ruled it out as too big minutes before the home invasion. They move on to the Cates home, which is smaller. They park across the road and move towards the house, Chris grabbing a knife and Steven grabbing a machete. The two others were unarmed. After circling the house, they see a small basement window that they are able to open. And Billy, one of the unarmed boys, goes into the basement. It was his job to let the rest of them in the house, but right away, Billy gets stuck, and there's no way for him to access the rest of the house. So they get Billy out of the basement, and Spader makes his way to the front porch. He's able to get through a screen window that held an air conditioner. Once inside, he lets Gribble, Billy, and Quinn into the home. They creep down the hallway that leads to two bedroom doors, illuminating their way with the light from an iPod. They enter the first bedroom, and it's empty. They search around a bit, and then they enter the second bedroom. Spader tries to keep the other three quiet, but something must have woken up the mother because she suddenly wakes up and calls out, "Jamie?" But her daughter answers right next to her in bed. The mother calls out, "Who's there?" And that's when Steven Spader attacks Kimberly Cates with a machete. Steven describes slashing and hacking away at her mercilessly. At this point, Jamie tries to escape, but Gribble stabs her in the right lung with his knife, stabs her again in the back, as Gribble would later say, trying to get to her heart. After doing this, Gribble throws Jamie into the sliding doors of the bedroom and she falls to the ground. Spader then goes over to the little girl and starts kicking her in the ribs and slashing her face with the machete. When Steven Spader is done, according to court documents, he says, "I'm bored," and tells Gribble to make sure that both mother and daughter are dead. Autumn Savoy tells police that Gribble checked on the mother, but he wasn't sure if anyone had checked on the little girl. After stealing some jewelry, the four teenagers leave the house, go to the car across the street, and put all the clothes they were wearing in a trash bag. So when they arrive at Autumn's house, they tell him this whole story, and they ask him if they can burn the bag of bloody clothes at his house. And immediately Autumn says no way. They are not burning evidence at his house. So they end up dumping the bag in the Nashua River, which is very close to Autumn's house and flows through New Hampshire and parts of Massachusetts. They then bury the knife that Chris had used to stab Jamie in the dirt nearby the river. Once they think the bag of clothes has sunk in the river, they just go to a convenience store and get some food like it was any other morning. After Autumn tells his story, the police bring in Chris Gribble to be interviewed, and he immediately denies any involvement in the murder. After telling the police his story about how he drove around all day with friends and really didn't have any memory of the day before, the troopers ask him what he thought about the murders and what he thought should happen to the people that performed those attacks. Gribble then said, "I would say they should probably go to prison for at least the rest of their lives. If the jury decides a death penalty, I probably wouldn't disagree with that. It really goes against me to harm a woman in general. But a little girl? That's like, how could you do that to somebody that young?" But the police continue to push Gribble, and then Gribble starts to get defensive. He says, "If you had evidence, you'd be arresting me right now. If you really had something, that's enough to charge me. and you're not arresting me, so I think you're bullshitting me and telling me that my friends are ratting me out. But after 3 hours of questioning, Chris Gribble eventually confesses to everything. And his voice is described as calm and matter-of-fact. Like he shut down and he was just stating what had happened. He said, "I just felt nothing. It was kind of cool because it was different." And of Jamie's survival, he said, "I'm kind of surprised she's alive. I kind of wish she died for her sake, just because she's going to have to live with all that now. If I had realized she was still alive, I would have ended it for her." Chris Gribble's interrogation took over 7 hours, and the next day, Steven Spader, Chris Gribble, William Marks, and Quinn Glover were all taken into custody. Steven Spader, 17, and Chris Gribble, 19, were charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and attempted murder, and were held without bail. William Marks, 18, and Quinn Glover, 17, were charged with burglary, conspiracy to commit burglary and robbery, and were held on $500,000 of cash bail. In addition to the main four, Adam Savoy was charged with hiding evidence and concocting an alibi. So who are these teenagers that decided to come together and kill someone in their own home? Let's start with Steven Spader, who is often referred to as the mastermind of this murder, which seems a little too complimentary if you ask me. Steven Spader was born in Arizona in November of 1991. There aren't many details about his birth parents, but it is known that his mother was addicted to drugs, and at the time of his birth, Steven had tested positive for marijuana and cocaine. Steven was adopted when he was 5 days old by a couple from New Hampshire, Christine and Steven Spader. Steven Sr. and Christine described Steven's childhood as idyllic. They were a family that vacationed and made a big deal out of birthdays. It was said that Steven Spader was a personable kid. He was a Boy Scout, he loved drama. He played Daddy Warbucks in Annie, and even shaved his head for the role. It was when Steven hit middle school, however, when things took a turn for the worse. By all accounts, his parents tried to get him the help he needed. They tried counselors, medication. They even took out an equity loan on their home to send him to a behavior program in 2008. Steven had been seen by numerous psychiatrists and had had a couple of brief stays in psychiatric hospitals, twice in the year before the murder. Among other things, Steven was diagnosed with bipolar disorder and major depression. Leading up to the murder, there were 2 violent interactions with his parents. Once where he pointed a gun at his father, and another when police had to intervene after Steven grabbed kitchen knives and began stabbing the counters and throwing food. Steven also had a criminal record. According to the Boston Globe, he had convictions of disorderly conduct, trespassing, and resisting arrest in the months leading up to the murder. Around this same time, Steven decides to form a club called the Disciples of Destruction with some of his high school friends. He designed a logo and everything. In a document later found on Spader's computer, it was said that Spader had been the president of this group, Gribble was a member, and Marks and Glovers were considered officers. The document explained that the main goal of the group was to make money and stay loyal to each other. Steven Spader told his friends that if they wanted to be in this club, they were going to have to be initiated, and they were going to be initiated by completing a home invasion. As mentioned, one of the members of this fake group was 19-year-old Chris Gribble. Chris was homeschooled by his mother, Tamara, and he too participated in Boy Scouts, which is where he and Steven met, but they didn't become friends until their teens. Chris claims to have been abused by his mother as a child, so extensively that he claimed that he wanted to kill her. According to Chris, she would regularly pin him down to the couch, told him not to make any noise, while she popped acne and other sores on his back and legs. His mother later admitted in court that she had spanked him once so hard when he was 5 that he wet himself and she broke the spoon during the spanking. Acquaintances of Chris said he was awkward, laughed nervously, and just could not pick up on social cues. His father Richard also stated that Christopher was intelligent and eloquent, but said that he had trouble telling when someone wanted him to stop talking. This wasn't the first robbery that Chris and Steven had done together. According to the Boston Globe, less than a week before Kimberly Cates' murder, the two of them had robbed a house close to Spader's home But there was no violence. They stole several items of jewelry, and then they pawned it off. The other 2 friends that went with Stephen and Chris were Quinn Glover and Billy Marks. The Boston Globe described Glover as an angst-ridden teen who was very insecure, and Billy as someone who was desperate to fit in. They had all agreed to be a part of this group, but both had testified that they really hadn't taken Spader seriously when they had arrived at the Cates' home that night. They assumed they were just going to participate in a robbery, but by then it was too late and they had become accomplices to murder. Glover and Marks pleaded guilty to robbery, burglary, and conspiracy to commit both. They agreed to cooperate with the state in exchange for a 20-year prison sentence. Autumn Savoy also cooperated with the state and pled guilty to hiding evidence and concocting an alibi. He was sentenced to 5 to 12 years in prison. Stephen Spader pled not guilty to all charges. Spader's trial began on October 25, 2010, a little over a year after the murder. And the court had a hard time with the jury selection. Many were disqualified for already believing Spader was guilty from what they had heard on the news, and others were scared to view any of the horrific evidence from the crime scene. In a lot of early articles about this case, another New Hampshire home invasion with similar circumstances was brought up a lot and seemed to impact the way the jury viewed the case. 2 professors were murdered in their home in 2001 by teenagers who chose their victims simply because they were home. While we won't get into details of that case now, I think we will cover it on another episode. While there was basically no physical evidence that put Spader at the scene of the crime, some of the strongest evidence against Spader at his trial were his own words. His bragging to friends about the attacks, and detailed notes he wrote to his cellmates while awaiting trial. According to the Boston Globe, one inmate shared letters that Stephen had written to him, and a lot of the details in those letters matched up with the details of the crime. I just want to give a quick trigger warning for some gore because Spader's letters are disgusting and he goes into vicious detail. So if you want to skip 15 seconds, now's the time to do it. Spader wrote that he had whacked the mother with the machete 36 times, which was very close to the 32 times that the medical examiner would later confirm. He said he could see brains, lots of blood, and her eyeball hanging out of its socket, which also matched some of the details of Kimberly's attack. The medical examiner said that a blow had gone through the skull and there was a slash under her left eye that had broken bone. In his letters to other cellmates, he also explained the disciples of destruction, in which he said that all 3 of the other members wanted to kill somebody, and he wanted to start a crew of like-minded individuals who, quote, had the balls to do crazy shit. He explained that he had set the home invasion in Mount Vernon up to see if his friends could really be a part of his crew. Aside from Stephen's own words, several search warrants were issued, and investigators found a plethora of evidence supporting the conspiracy to commit murder charge. On Stephen's computer, they found the Disciples of Destruction bylaws, the officer list, as well as some very incriminating internet searches. In the weeks leading up to the crime, Spader had told his co-conspirators that he wanted to use chloroform in order to incapacitate his victims, tie them up, so that they could be easily moved to other locations to be tortured for financial information and then murdered. On the morning of October 3rd, less than 12 hours before the attack, Spader used Autumn Savoy's computer to search how to make chloroform. He then made a similar search on his own computer at home. From his research, he determined that he needed ice, bleach, and acetone, which he would later put on a list for Quinn Glover to go shop for. But it seemed that Glover had a hard time figuring out where to get acetone. Gribble had also attempted to get acetone from his girlfriend. Text messages between him and Spader revealed that he wasn't able to get it, and maybe they should just go and buy it from Walmart. Clearly, no one in this group realized that acetone is just nail polish remover, because no one was able to get it that evening. The text messages between Gribble and Spader revealed that they were bringing gloves, rope, and plastic bags. In addition to what these search warrants revealed, Autumn Savoy, Quinn Glover, and Billy Marks testified against Stephen during his trial. After they broke into the Cates' home, Glover said that the 4 approached a closed bedroom door with weapons out. He said that Spader and Gribble were in the lead. Spader had a machete, and Gribble had a knife. Glover said that when he heard screams starting in the bedroom, he turned around and covered his ears. When the prosecutor asked him why he did this, he said, "I walked away because I wanted to walk away from the situation. I didn't take anything that was said prior seriously. That was my mistake." Glover said that Spader's plan for the home invasion was far more twisted than what had actually happened. He told the jury that Spader wanted to break into homes, kill the occupants, stay overnight, roast and eat the victims, and stage the bodies for the media. Immediately after the attacks, Glover said that Spader was euphoric, excited. He seemed like he had just gotten off a roller coaster. He came out with the machete covered in blood and hair. According to the Boston Globe, Autumn Savoy's testimony revealed that after the murders, Spader and Gribble had seen the news of the crime, and Stephen had said to Gribble, "You idiot, you couldn't even kill a 5th grader." Savoy said that after they found out Jamie survived, quote, "Chris seemed depressed because he really wanted to kill somebody." Another piece of evidence was the pawn shop receipt that the trooper found in the back of Chris's car. David Cates, Kimberly's husband and Jamie's father, was called to the stand to identify the jewelry that had been pawned off that morning. He positively identified all of it as Kimberly's. The way that Stephen Spader acted during his trial did not help his case. According to one Boston Globe article, Spader at times seemed excited when certain evidence was presented, as if he was proud to show off his crime. He smiled as one of the jurors cried, and was seen making threatening gestures to the witnesses. On October 9, 2010, on Stephen Spader's 19th birthday, it took the jury 90 minutes to declare Stephen Spader guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Kimberly Cates. Superior Court Judge Jillian Abrams sentenced Stephen to life without parole, and that he belongs in a cage for the rest of his pointless life. Now, Chris Gribble, on the other hand, pled insanity, so his trial didn't start until March 2011. He took the stand in his insanity trial and testified about what he called troubled childhood and his fantasies about killing his mother. He said he had always wanted to kill someone, and when he finally did, he felt relief. His description of the night was disgusting. He talks about stabbing little Jamie Cates when she jumped out of bed and ran towards him, and he said he thought the scene looked like something out of the show CSI. And while some of what he said would be considered crazy, that doesn't make you insane to the courts. And if we look at what Chris did, he hid the gloves, he lied to police, he knew it was wrong. Insanity pleas are very rare. According to one study by the National Institute of Mental Health, less than 1% of county court cases involve the insanity defense, and of those, only 1 in 4 were successful. Of about half the cases that have been indicted for violent crimes, only 15% were murder cases. So it's rare to be deemed too mentally ill to be relieved of criminal responsibility. Despite his defense of insanity, on March 25, 2011, Chris Gribble was found guilty and sane in the murder of Mount Vernon mother, Kimberly Cates. He was also sentenced to life without parole. At Gribble's sentencing, Jamie Cates, now 12 years old, was in attendance. She didn't attend any other hearings, but the senior attorney general told the Boston Globe she wanted to see the defendant taken away. The judge said to her, "You are a lovely little girl, and I hope you know that this man and the other men involved in this terrible crime can never hurt you again." Jamie Cates is now 23 years old and living her best life. She did an interview in 2019 where she said she's studying public health and playing field hockey at the University of North Carolina. She has a dog named Brighton, and she says she's living every day like it's her last. The community of Mount Vernon created the Kimberly Cates Memorial Fund, which has given out more than $250,000 in scholarships to students who continue her legacy of helping others by beginning their post-secondary studies in the field of medicine. We will put a link in the show notes if you would like to donate. This episode was written by Alexa Morrissey, researched by Victoria Cox, and produced by Michael Morrissey, John Scassia, and Heidi Sherman. Stranger in the House is a Boy Wonder production. All our sources for this episode will be linked in the bio and on our website, strangerinthehouse.com.
You can follow us at strangerinthehouse.com, at _strangerinthehouse on Instagram and TikTok, and at _strangerpod on Twitter.
Stay safe, strangers.